Okay, and we are live with the first virtual session for Inbox Expo. We have a fantastic session covering the state of authentication. What authentication? Obviously, email authentication. But Chris and Brian will be going through a session with lots of takeaways and lots of information about where we are today and where we probably need to be. I'm not going to eat into too much of their time. I do want to thank everyone on AME for bearing with us while we ironed out the technical problems. Hopefully this is streaming flawlessly. If you are witnessing any issues, just go to the LinkedIn Live link that we've posted in the chat and you will be able to join us there. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Brian and Chris. I should point out that Red Sift and Entrust, whilst Brian and Chris are joining us virtually, are the sponsors of the registration area and our lanyards, and generally brilliant, great friends of Email Expert, and we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing if it wasn't for the support of Red Sift and Entrust repeatedly come back and help us out as well. So we are eternally grateful personally and as an organization to both of these orgs, Red Sift and Entrust, and they do really stellar work. So I'm sure they're going to have an awful lot of data, which is really valuable to all of us. Chris, Brian, how are you doing?
Great.
Hey, Andrew, great to be with you.
It would be better in person, but this is almost as good. I am going to cut myself out and allow you guys to take over.
Sounds
great. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Brian Wessinge, I look after alliances and partnerships here at Red Sift, and I'm joined with Chris Bailey, who's VP of Trust Services at Entrust. And we have some custom research we wanted to present to you today. As Andrew said, we'd love to be with you in person, but next best thing is virtual. And we do have some colleagues there on site whom you've hopefully have met, and would be very happy to talk to you about any of these data findings and conclusions, and a special offer we have for both virtual and in-person attendees that we'll talk about at the end. So stay tuned for that. But we know you've heard a lot already during the Inbox Expo about SPF, DMARC, BIMI, and VMCs. So we wanted to take a deep dive into some data, both by vertical market, size of company, employees, and a few other data points, which I think will be really interesting and might lend you to draw some different conclusions about BIMI adoption and VMC adoption, especially over the last year. So we'll dive into some data. Hopefully we are presenting things you haven't heard a million times. And again, will help inform kind of your discussions, both internally and potentially for those of you who are service providers with your customers around DMARC, BIMI, and VMC. So we took, just to begin with, we took kind of the foundational piece of DMARC, of email authentication as it relates to BIMI and VMC. So that is DMARC reporting generally, and then DMARC enforcement specifically. So Google went live with BIMI and VMC last July. So we wanted to take a look at growth in both DMARC records, BIMI records, and VMCs since July of 2021. So what we've seen since the Google announcement is roughly an increase of 1 million DMARC records being created. So that's the blue line, is started out around 2 million DMARC records last year this time. And by the way, the source of this is a site that Red Sift and Entrust operate called BIMIRadar.com. We track the authentication status of 65 million domains and growing on a daily basis. And we look for things like, do these domains have SPF or DKIM records? Do they have DMARC? Do they have BIMI records? And do they have VMC? So everything we can observe in DNS as it relates to email authentication. So over the last year, we saw an increase in about 1 million DMARC records generally. And then to be BIMI ready means that your DMARC policy must be quarantine or reject. So these are Apex domains that we're looking at, or the top level domains. So we saw quite a bit of growth in BIMI ready domains, so domains with a quarantine and reject policy, those went from about 800,000 records in July of 2021 to about 1.4 million records this month to date, actually, if you include August. So we can see that, I would say that the BIMI record or BIMI ready growth is slightly outpacing even the DMARC reporting growth. So that suggests that more domains that have DMARC today are getting to DMARC enforcement. And I like to think of BIMI as either the reward for doing the hard work of implementing DMARC and SPF and DKIM, or potentially you could think of it as the carrot that the mailbox providers like Google and Yahoo are using. They want domain owners to adopt authentication because authentication is one signal that a message is wanted and legitimate. So, the more folks that adopt authentication, the easier the mailbox provider job is. And to do that, they say, hey, you want logo display and email? Great. Do DMARC first and get your domain ready, and then you can reap the benefit, which is BIMI and VMC. So again, growth of about 1 million DMARC records over the last year, and about almost a doubling in the amount of BIMI ready domains. And if you look at kind of BIMI record growth in DNS, so BIMI records are text records in DNS. At the time of the Google announcement last year, there were already a little over 5,000 BIMI records. That's because Yahoo has been in production with BIMI for a few years prior to the Google announcement. So folks had created BIMI records, and Yahoo does not require a VMC or the verified mark certificate. So by the time Google went GA with BIMI and VMC, there were already several thousand BIMI records in existence. And over the last year, we've seen that almost double. I think there's nearly 12,000 BIMI records out of the 65 million domains that we analyzed that have those records today. So BIMI records generally are growing quite quickly. And then VMC growth relative to BIMI growth is even more impressive. So these are growth rates in general. So certainly BIMI, I mentioned, there's about 12,000 BIMI records. The verified mark certificates today, there's roughly about 800 that have been issued for Apex domains. And you can see that if you go to BIMIradar.com, you can see the types of verticals that are adopting BIMI. But the rate of growth of VMC right now is outpacing the rate of growth of BIMI records generally. And that's because, of course, BIMI is starting from a larger position in terms of the absolute numbers of BIMI records already. But we see with the adoption that VMC adoption is outpacing BIMI record adoption, at least if you look at the actual growth rate. So what this suggests to me, just since the start of the year here, you can see fairly consistent 15% growth in VMCs, and that's outpacing BIMI a little bit. So we expect to see more and more adoption of VMC over the next year. Chris will talk a little bit about kind of some of the trends that are helping to increase adoption of VMC. And we expect to see additional industries, size of companies, and logos adopting VMC over the next year. I'll talk a little bit about what we see right now and then what we expect.
And Brian, just to make one comment on that previous slide, I think these are month-over-month numbers.
Yes.
And not year-over-year numbers. So
Correct.
That's important.
Yeah, monthly growth rate, month-over-month, correct. Thanks for pointing that out, Chris. So we took a look at 3 major vertical markets just to see what was going on with DMARC, SPF, BIMI, and VMC. So we took a look at companies that were over 1,000 employees that were headquartered in North America, just for purposes of this analysis. So we looked at almost 2,700 domains in total of retailers. And you can kind of see from the charts that, one thing I noticed in particular is SPF is not a solved problem still. For those of us that have been in email for a long time, SPF has been around, 20 years or over 20 years now. but we still see issues with people stuffing their SPF records with include statements to platforms maybe they don't even use anymore. So if you add a new platform to send mail for you, maybe you don't remove the old platform from your record. And over time, we see SPF records get bloated. So you can see 157 domains out of this 2,700 just have SPF lookups over 10, so 11 and above. So there's still a fair number of those. The interesting thing I noticed from this is, roughly 40. So if you add a new platform to send mail for you, maybe you don't, remove the old platform from your record. And over time, we see SPF records get bloated. So you can see, 157 domains out of this 2,700 just have SPF lookups over 10, so 11 and above. So there's still a fair number of those. The interesting thing I noticed from this is, roughly 40. So if you had a new platform to send mail for you, maybe you don't.
Andrew, I'm hearing myself speak.
My record. And over time,
about a minute
we see SPF
lag.
records get bloated. So you can see, 157 domains out of this 2,700 just have SPF lookups over 10, so 11 and above. So there's still a fair number of those. The interesting thing I noticed from this is, roughly 40. So if you had a new platform to send mail for you,
Now I'm looping myself. So bear with us for a second, folks.
And over time,
About a minute
we see
lag.
SPF records get bloated. So you can see, 157 domains out of this 2,700 just have SPF lookups over 10.
Okay, I'm not sure what's happening here, folks. That's all a little odd. So I'm hoping if I unmute them again, it'll be back to normal. Yeah, I think it is. Are you guys watching on AirMeet? Could you switch off AirMeet, please? I think you're watching your own session, aren't you? Could you switch your session off? No?
I'm not.
Yep, that could have been it, Andrew.
Yeah. Okay, there you go.
All right, perfect. Well, if anybody's a fan of Westworld, the TV show on HBO, that felt a little bit like Westworld. We were in an infinite loop there, but sorry for that, guys. What I noticed from this data, though, is that over 40% of all the retail domains that we analyzed have a DMARC record of any kind, and then out of those domains that do have DMARC records, about 45% of them are ready for BIMI today, which means they're at quarantine or reject. So in my mind, why not take advantage of this benefit? You've done the hard work on DMARC. Part of that is because, the IT and security teams, which have been kind of the first adopters of DMARC, they may not be talking to marketing. They might not even be aware of BIMI. And the folks who work in marketing that may be aware of BIMI, aren't involved with DMARC implementation on non-marketing domains. So we do find within organizations that sometimes you have to bridge the gap between your IT and security teams, people that manage your corporate mail servers, and then the folks in marketing that are interested in BIMI. So I'll start moving a little quicker now that I lost some time on this. But you can see out of those 2,700 domains, we found about 35 BIMI records in total. And out of that, a little less than half actually had gone to the effort of getting a verified MARC certificate. And you can see some of those domains here. Next vertical we looked at, because we thought adoption might be high in the hospitality sector as well. Again, looked at North American companies, over 1,000 employees, about 2,000 domains, still a lot of broken SPF records. And then again, about 40% of the domains that did have DMARC records were already eligible for BIMI. And 18 total BIMI records within this data set. And then there were 5 VMCs from, OpenTable, I think everyone recognizes. Culver's is a fast food chain here in the US, Bon Appetit Magazine, and then Kayak Travel. So interesting kind of cross set of logos within this group. But, fairly consistent results with the retail data set. And then finally, we looked at healthcare. So healthcare is a highly targeted industry for spoofing and phishing, because healthcare records are very valuable, kind of like financial services records. So healthcare is a really targeted industry. A few years ago, the chairman of the healthcare ISAC, which is an information sharing working group, said we want all of our member organizations to adopt DMARC, and we're going to name and shame the organizations that don't. That never happened, but I was expecting to see more adoption in healthcare versus some of these other verticals that we looked at. But really, there was slightly less implementation of DMARC overall, but the folks that had implemented DMARC, about the same percentage were ready for BIMI in terms of having a quarantine or reject record. But we were only able to find 4 BIMI records total within these about 800 domains that we analyzed, and then 1 VMC within that group. So still a lot of opportunity for VMC and BIMI within healthcare. But what kind of the conclusions we drew, out of all of this, retail was certainly the industry we expected to see implementing DMARC, BIMI, and VMC, and that kind of was borne out. But it was interesting across all the verticals, roughly 45% of them today could go ahead and implement BIMI from a DMARC perspective. They were already qualified from a DMARC perspective. There are a few more requirements around VMC that we'll talk about it if you want to get the verified mark certificate. It's not good enough just to be a DMARC enforcement. There's a few other things involved that we'll talk about. And then finally, to me, as somebody that's worked in email deliverability and authentication for a long time, people still struggle with SPF. And I know in the Inbox Expo, there's already been a lot of talk around SPF, and there's solutions that folks can use these days to solve for that 10 lookup limit. But still a problem that a lot of folks run into, as well as misconfiguring their DMARC records generally. Sometimes people put in multiple records for the same domain, or there's typos or syntax errors, etc. So if you're embarking on a DMARC project, you do have to have a level of attention to detail and make sure that you're not just making a really basic error with syntax or multiple records and things like that. So I want to keep on moving in terms of looking at VMCs in particular, because VMCs are publicly available lookups in DNS as well. So out of the 800 or so Apex domains that have VMCs today, we were able to associate around 650 of them to known organizations in a particular vertical that we could analyze. And so the really interesting thing I found about this data is I was expecting to see VMCs implemented mainly by larger organizations, and that really wasn't the case. It was, what we found was, that folks implementing VMCs, generally, more than half were issued to companies with less than 50 million in revenue and less than 250 employees. So the early adopters really of VMCs are within smaller organizations that maybe don't have massive resources that you would expect that would have implemented this. So this was a really interesting finding to us, not only, again, expecting larger companies with more resources to be implementing, but the data we could see in DNS didn't really bear that out. So that was something that was news to all of us. And then if you look at roughly 20 or so vertical markets that we saw with VMCs, first of all, there was many more than I would have expected. I wasn't expecting to see, manufacturing to show up big in VMC. I wasn't expecting, energy and utilities to show up at all. Education, that's kind of interesting. So if you have a university or some other educational institution, folks are adopting VMCs within that as well. So really kind of broad-based adoption across many different verticals. Certainly in B2C, you would see, the usual suspects, financial services, retail, hospitality. And then in B2B, certainly, technology companies, because they're early adopters generally, and then business services and manufacturing. So roughly 21 different verticals represented here that made up the majority of the VMCs that have been issued. But, the findings for me that are interesting are really broad-based vertical adoption. Smaller companies with fewer resources are getting the job done when it comes to VMC. So the message, I think, for this audience is, hey, even if you're not a major, Fortune 1000 company, this BIMI, DMARC, VMC are something that's well within your grasp to implement and still be an early adopter and get kind of first mover advantage from that logo display and email. So in terms of the location of all the companies that had VMCs, we saw very broad-based adoption by location. So we found about 50 different countries that had been, or if your organization was headquartered in one of those 50 countries, I should say. So there are 11 trademark jurisdictions where you need to have your logo trademarked or have a registered word mark. So there's 11 jurisdictions for your logo, but we see, in terms of headquarters locations, there's very broad adoption of VMC, and that just means like, hey, if my company headquarters is in Switzerland, maybe my logo is registered in the United Kingdom, for instance. So that's really interesting. The location of the headquarters, certainly primarily the Americas to date, followed by EMEA and then APAC. We see that a lot with kind of technology solutions in general being adopted in the Americas, then going to Europe, then going to Asia Pacific. And I think overall with DMARC growth, the record growth, if that keeps up, like let's say there's another 50% increase in DMARC record adoption over the last year. I think there's going to be an expanded market for VMC based on some of the conditions that Chris is going to talk about and the ease of access to VMCs. We expect to see these growth rates continue. And if Inbox Expo happens next summer, would love to come back and kind of rerun this data and show you where we're at a year from now. But I think it's fair to say we expect to see DMARC adoption continue, VMC adoption continue, and BIMI growth continue as well. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned this a little bit, but I would say, if you look at a standard technology adoption curve, I think we're still well within that innovator section of a technology adoption curve. And but that said, there's room for you or your customers to kind of stand out in the inbox today because you are, an innovator, and your logo being displayed in a Google mailbox or soon to be, Apple iOS 16 or Mac OS Ventura. I mean, that's still unusual just to get that logo display, especially in Gmail and eventually Apple. So why not take advantage of, brand recall and drive opens and purchases from having your logo be displayed before everybody else, starts adopting BIMI and VMC. So finally, the one other thing I wanted to take a look at in terms of attendees to the Inbox Expo, I mean, we already know you're smarter and you're better looking, than the average email professional, but certainly you're above average, I think, in terms of authentication. So almost 80% of the domains we looked at for attendees have a DMARC record. 60% of those records were at quarantine or reject already. So that is well above average based on what we see just generally across any type of audience or vertical that we look at. There were some attendees that still have SPF issues with too many lookups, or folks that were right at 10 lookups, which usually suggests that they've had to manually manage their SPF records to try to stay under the 10 lookup limit. Kudos to the 22 attendees that have BIMI records already. So well done. There's definitely room for more of you based on who's at quarantine or reject already to adopt BIMI. And then outside of Redsift and Entrust, who already have VMCs, there were 4 attendees that have already gotten their VMCs as well. So Shipstead, you'll hear a little bit more about their BIMI journey tomorrow. Kiwi.com, Australian Retirement Trust, and Validity. So well done to those folks that have already implemented BIMI and VMC. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris, talk a little bit about some of the changes we saw over the last year and what's coming.
Yep, thanks, Brian. So as Brian mentioned, and many of you already know, we did a production launch with Gmail last July. And since then, I wanted just to kind of cover some of the major events. We launched with 8 jurisdictions. We did expand that to 11, and we did that in the January timeframe. We also, in the spring timeframe, we actually moved to a more of a notification or a video authentication process and dropped the notary, or using the notary as an alternative. Formally, why that's important is we actually had to have face-to-face visits to do the before we actually issued the VMC. So that was a hurdle that was removed. And then there are more integrations that happened when we launched. It was the website, the webmail piece was working. The Android native client was also working. iOS actually started working a few months later. So that integration was wrapped up, at least for this phase. And then most recently, we started introducing the concept called government marks, where a registered trademark is filed with, for example, the U.S. with the USPTO office. This is something that's more or less made by an executive or legislation type function, so a statute created logo. And many departments in the United States, for example, are like that, and around the world it's very similar. Some are decreed by kings or other type of situations. So that actually is a methodology that we can leverage to give governments verified mark certificates, but they're called government mark certificates. Also, what's happening for the rest of this year? Many of you have probably already seen that Apple is looking to adopt BIMI. We're waiting to see what the final implementation will look like. So that's in process, but we've heard good things. One thing in that implementation is the concept of that they've put out there called digitally certified email. So that'll be really interesting to see how that actually works out too. So we're looking forward to understanding what the final definition of that actually is going to be, what they have in their testing dev environment, and beta is actually going to be similar in the future. So, but that actually could create a separation of these emails coming in and providing some additional information about the what actually is being conveyed as far as the definition of that. And then finally, more jurisdictions. We're working to add those as well. And this is, there are only 5 months left in the year, and so there's a lot more things that we're working on, a lot more things that we would like to see happen. But these are things I just wanted to wrap up the final few months of the year. This is what I think is probably what you'll see happening in 2022. We do have another presentation tomorrow. I'm going to be presenting at 11:30 a.m. Eastern about the future of VMC, where I'll dive down a little further and go beyond 2022. So I invite you to come look at that. But this session is just too long to cover. But there's some exciting things that we're working on. So please feel free to join us. Also, I want to cover some resources that we have. So many of the things that we've pointed out here today, you can go and look at some of that data here, these resources. BIMI Radar, as Brian mentioned, is something that we work on that tracks many of the Apex domains and let you know the progress of BIMI as well as DMARC in the various stages. We're also have our own site that you can see here, and RedSift's site that you can go and check out your own status for DMARC and BIMI. The BIMIgroup.org is a reference site for BIMI. You can see who's actually supporting BIMI on their website under resources. And we also have an information pack that the RedSift has as well, and as well as another really good site for information, DMARC.org. We mentioned at the top of this presentation that we were going to offer something special. The special offer is free VMC for the first year, and this is a way for many of you who are looking to test out the VMC, see how it works for you, to get that. There are 18 that already have domains that are ready to go. I think that might be updated to 22, if I remember that correctly. So if you are in that status, we recommend that you look at VMC. You can get it right away. But if you don't have that, we can, RedSift can also help you get to that state as well. So I highly encourage everyone to take up this offer. If you are interested, please talk to Faisal or Christina. Arwan from RedSift, and of course, Brian, who's available for that as well. Just to, to kind of repeat the requirements, you do need to have a trademark, and you also need to have DMARC enforcement of quarantine 100% or higher. I think with that, we are ending our session 1 minute in time.
The consummate professionals. So before we go, I've got someone hiding in the corner. Please come down here, Faisal. So this is who you're looking for tomorrow, Faisal. He'll be here from the morning, and free VMC certificates. I don't know who wants to say no to that. And for those that haven't caught that, didn't catch the session, I'll repeat it. I'm going to thank you very much for this session. And I'm going to run downstairs because there's still people in a separate session, and let them know about the VMC offer while they're all still there. And tell them the details will be in your email. But thank you both so much for this, and we will repeat it. It's on LinkedIn Live already, so feel free to share it with your network. Anyone that's watching, feel free to share it with your network. Sorry, that ping. Yes, it was. Private questions that don't want to be posted. Now, if anyone's on LinkedIn, okay. So if anyone's on LinkedIn, feel free to ask questions. I'll share some of your feedback, and I've been DM'd. That's my pinging in the background. Why is it that healthcare hasn't really adopted BIMI so much? Is it a lack of DMARC knowledge, or is it a lack of caring, or is it something else? What's driving that?
Yeah, good question. My sense, without, and it would be kind of an educated guess, is that the marketing arm of healthcare companies either has not been aware of BIMI, or may not be as connected with the IT and security organizations within healthcare organizations. I think it's, retail and hospitality, that just makes sense to all of us, right? Those verticals are really heavily marketing oriented. I wouldn't say necessarily that healthcare is known for being marketing driven or marketing led. So, Chris, I don't know if you feel any differently, but my thought is just less focus on marketing generally. Perhaps it means less BIMI records and less VMCs. But
I think also the healthcare, and it depends on what we're talking about, but larger healthcare companies are have more resources. Smaller, they tend to wear more hats, so they have maybe less of a dedicated resource to perform these types of services. So I've actually seen this actually happen in other industries before, where the tier one players will adopt and the rest will somewhat lag. So it's a different shaped curve on the adoption. That's a phenomenon mostly in the US.
Well, hopefully that answered their question. And again, I want to thank you, but I do want to try and catch the 60 odd people that are downstairs and let them know about this offer. And I'll double check with you two. Chuck reckons this is good for the clients of the delegates that are here. So if you're an ESP and you've got 100 clients, you're also welcome to do this. Is this right?
Yes.
Yep.
Fantastic. What an offer. Okay, I'm about to go down and tell 20 ESPs that they've got free VMCs for all their customers. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic night, gents.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Okay, I'm just really going downstairs.